Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you all very much for coming out on this beautiful summer's day. My name is Lisa Oldham. I'm the Executive Director of New Canaan Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. I'd like to ask before I forget if everyone can please silence your cell phones. And a few bits to get out of the way before I welcome others to the stage. First of all, I'm so pleased to see Mrs. Hazel Hobbs here. Hazel came up with the idea for this lecture about 11 plus years ago and got the ball rolling for what has been 11 years of some of the most remarkable speakers that we've had annually here. Everyone who is asked to be a lecturer at the Conversations with Business Leaders is someone who is at the top of their field and who's also connected to New Canaan, either living here now or, in the case of Marysue, someone who grew up here and has moved away. So before I tell you any more about what's happening today, I wanted to let all of you know who have children or teens that we are about to kick off what is probably going to be the biggest summer reading program we've ever had. Joust Read, as you might imagine, is all about things medieval, and it's for both children and teens this year, and sign-ups are on June 19th. So, it is our practice with this lecture to invite last year's speaker to do the introduction to this year's speaker, and it is my pleasure to now welcome Rich Riley to the podium.
Hello, everyone. It's a great honor to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Marysue Rucci, who grew up in New Canaan and is a 1988 graduate of New Canaan High School. She graduated from Northwestern University in 1992 with a degree in English and creative writing, and then attended the Radcliffe Publishing course. Her career in trade publishing began in 1994 at HarperCollins, and she's gone on to hold positions at Scribner, Villard, a division of Random House, Simon & Schuster, Putnam, a division of Penguin, and returned to Simon & Schuster in 2012 as editor-in-chief, overseeing fiction at the imprint and acquiring later a mix of fiction and nonfiction. Over the years, Ms. Rucci has worked with illustrious and best-selling authors such as Kathy Reichs, Eve Ensler, Betty White, Hunter S. Thompson, Jeffrey Deaver, Sandra Brown, Mary Higgins Clark, Nelson DeMille, Lauren Weisberger, Alice Hoffman, Jessica Knoll, Rebecca Traister, Chris Cleave, Hoda Kotb, and many more. She's a member of the Women's Media Group and has served on its board, and she lives in Manhattan with her daughter and is the first grade class mom. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Rucci to the...
How's that? No? Yeah? Just say something? Hi. Oh, you can hear me? Oh, what a room. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Rich, for that introduction. It is such an honor to be in this building. It is no understatement to say that this building and the former building across the street were formative in my career. I spent so many hours in the stacks here, and so many hours at Center School with the great Hazel Hobbs and of course Mrs. McDonald somewhere in the room, and maybe Mrs. Dormer. Oh, we had the Center School reunion yesterday, so a lot of people came over. It was such a special place, and it really helped forge my love of reading, and of course my parents, who my mother never was without a book, and my father is a big reader, and of course he told me not to be a lawyer, even though he is one. Thank you to Lisa Oldham for having me. Thank you to everyone at the library. Amara Johnson, I know, can't be here, but Julie Wright, thank you. Brooke Moore, if I'm forgetting anyone, I apologize. Thank you to my brother Dave, who is on the board, for encouraging me to be here, and Ian Hobbs, Hazel's son, who is also on the board, who was a classmate of mine at New Canaan High School and also encouraged me to be here. So I am Marysue Rucci. I am editor-in-chief and vice president at Simon & Schuster. I acquire a mix of fiction and nonfiction, more fiction than nonfiction, about 80%. And I oversee all the fiction at the imprint. And my job is to cultivate, nurture, and attract talent to the imprint, and to shape our list. And I love my job. So it's daunting to be here in many ways. I don't usually talk about myself. I usually get to proselytize about the authors and books that I love and with whom I work and on which I work. So I'm new to PowerPoint too, so forgive me if I go too fast. And I'm going to go through my career and talk a little bit about what Simon & Schuster is, what I do, how I got to where I am, and then I'm going to open it up to questions so you have a sense of what's to come. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, no, maybe not. Oh, no. I'm glad I gave you that disclaimer. Well, would anyone like to dance? Grace, come on. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so Simon & Schuster is one of the big 5 publishers. It also includes Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Hachette, and Macmillan. We are a publicly held company. We're owned by CBS. We are made up of many different imprints, adult and children's. I work at Simon & Schuster, which is the flagship imprint, but the whole company is also known as Simon & Schuster. We publish across all imprints about 2,000 books a year. We have 1,300 employees worldwide, and our imprint, flagship, is the biggest imprint. We have 14 acquiring editors. We do 120 to 130 titles per year, and about a quarter of that is fiction. So that gives you a sense of what we do. I am going to fly the flag here because last year, Simon & Schuster was #1 in bestsellers, both by title count and weeks on the New York Times bestseller list of all the imprints in the industry. Thank you. Here are some of the books that made that happen and some new books as well. Ooh, let's see if I can do, oh no. Okay. Oh yes, okay. So Fear was a #1 bestseller. Frederick Douglass won the Pulitzer Prize and was a bestseller. Mary Higgins Clark is a bestseller. These are some of the books that we do. The library book, which was a wonderful book and of course very appropriate for this edifice. Library book was another bestseller. It was also a Reese Witherspoon book club pick. When Life Gives You Lululemons was kind of the book of last summer and is out in paperback now. Nelson DeMille, #1 bestseller. Bruce Springsteen's biography, #1 bestseller. Rules of Magic, also a top 5 bestseller. David McCullough is just out. This is the summer read for you and your Father's Day gift. It was a #1 bestseller, and Howard Stern. So this is kind of the range that we publish. We do serious history, politics, celebrity, biography, and then our fiction ranges from commercial and upmarket book club fiction to literary fiction. So I know these talks are usually about business. My business is so strange because it's this combination of commerce and art and, as my publisher likes to say, black swans. If you're familiar with that term, that is something that is highly improbable. And then it has these characteristics of unpredictability, massive impact, and our desperation to try to concoct a rationale for why it happened after the fact. This is publishing, because publishing, most of our books don't work. Most of them are not profitable. My finance friends are horrified when I tell them our business practices and how we come up with these P&Ls and how we send books out and then take them back when they don't sell. Those are called returns, and this was a business practice that was implemented in the Great Depression when people had no money, and we said to bookstores, please just take our books and we'll take them back. Well, the Depression is over, and we are still taking books back. So it's also a very subjective industry. I am one person who has a very specific list and a very specific sensibility. And my treasure may be another editor's trash. It's all very highly, highly subjective. And so we all although we budget and we have the tentpole authors like a Nelson DeMille who we know are going to be successful, we also all hope and pray for lightning to strike or that black swan. This is what people think I do all day. And I am sorry to tell you this is not the case. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what a book editor does. I'm a talent scout, as I mentioned. I'm always looking for the next new voice and something original and compelling and moving. I didn't say thank you to my daughter. Oh my gosh. I have to say, the best reader I know is my 6-year-old daughter right now, and she's in the front row, and I skipped that entirely. I'm looking at her right now. I apologize. I had to just interrupt that presentation to say that. And if you need a book, honey, you know where to find one. So I'm a talent scout, and when I'm trying to attract people to my imprint and to my stable, as we call it, I have a vision for the book. And I have to go to my boss and I have to get money. So I become a lobbyist. I tell him how many copies I think we're going to sell, and then I ask for an extremely ridiculous amount of money usually. And then I try to buy the book, and if I prevail, then I become the coach, the therapist, sometimes the antagonist, and the adversary with the author, trying to get that book to its best possible iteration. I also help conceive of the jacket design. I actually work on the book design with the design department. I think about the end papers, and I think about how it feels in your hand and the weight of the paper and maps. And so I do a lot of artistry, and then I become a salesperson. So when the book is finished, I go in front of my sales force and my marketing force and my publicists, and I pitch it. And I say, this is how we should sell this book. On Tuesday, I'll be presenting our list from spring 2020. So that's how far in advance we're working. I already have the jackets for those books. I already have the manuscripts in. I have blurbs for them. I reach out to other authors and ask them to read the book early and endorse the books. So I'm working at any one time on a book that's going to publish in 2 years, a book that will publish next week, a book that will publish in 4 months. It's very fluid. And ultimately, conviction is the key. This is me. Really, I'm just a cog, I'm the hub, and I work with sales, production, publicity, art, author, and the agent, legal, marketing. People always ask how I find the books. The majority of them are agented. I probably receive 6 to 10 manuscripts a week, and they're full manuscripts because I mostly do fiction, and that's about, let's say, 300 pages, so do the math. So 1,800 to possibly more pages a week that I'm reviewing and considering to acquire, not only for my list, but then there are other editors who are bringing me manuscripts to read, and I have to okay every novel that comes across Simon & Schuster's transom. The rarer occasion where I find books is that I go out and I seek out the authors. And this happens mostly with nonfiction, more with nonfiction than fiction, although sometimes I'm chasing an author for years. I'm writing love letters and saying, I love your work. That sometimes works. It's sometimes a very long process. My boss was writing love letters to John Irving for 10 years before he actually came to Simon & Schuster. I wrote love letters to Nelson DeMille for, I think, 5 or 6 before he came over. And then the most rare is slush, which means unsolicited, comes over the transom. Somebody knows somebody knows somebody knows Marysue, and here it is. And I think, oh no. And in my 25 years, 2 books have actually been published. So you can see the rate of success is very low. I'm still open, but it's really hard. Successful editors move decisively and quickly. And they are able to rally others to their cause. I thought it was going to be an introspective, bookish career. I thought I was going to be behind closed doors and quietly reading. In fact, I have to be forward-facing all the time. I'm out with agents and authors and in meetings, and it's not what I thought it was going to be. Again, I love it, but there you go. So how did I get here? I mentioned Center School. That's a terrible picture of it. But I did mention Center School and Dr. Rubin. It was so wonderful. And I went to Sachs Middle School, and I went to New Canaan High School. I edited The Spectator, and always had a penchant for reading and writing. I always loved literature. I went to Northwestern University, and as Rich mentioned, I was a creative writing major there. That was a program that you applied to get into after 2 years of prerequisites, and they took up to 15 students. They took 12 the year I was in it. And then we spent 2 years workshopping each other's work, writing essays, writing stories, and working on each other's work. And that was seminal for me because I realized that I was a better editor than a writer, and I loved it. After that, I moved to Portland, Oregon, much to my parents' chagrin. I remember driving out the driveway, and they were looking at me like, "You're doing what?" And I didn't have a job, and I was a deli maid. And while I was there, I kind of realized quickly that that was not enough, and New Canaan played a big role here as well because Ross Eberman, who grew up in New Canaan, worked at a small publisher out there called Graphic Arts Center Publishing, and he gave me an internship. And I started working in the marketing department there, and I realized, wow, this is great, but if I'm going to do it right, I should probably go to New York. And my parents had moved next door to this man named Don Lamb, who was the editor-in-chief of W.W. Norton, and he had me in for an informational interview and said, "Why don't you apply for a sales job in Tennessee?" And I thought, oh no, I can't do that. But how about you write me a recommendation for this publishing course at Radcliffe? And he did. So I went to a Radcliffe publishing course for a summer. It was a 6-week course. It was taught by people who work in the industry. It's now moved to Columbia, and I have appeared there as a resource person. It's fabulous. I'll never forget John Battelle, who was the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine. This was 1994, sitting in a room, 92 students from great universities from all over the country, and he said, "How many of you have heard of something called the World Wide Web?" And like 3 of us raised our hands. Not me. So I moved to New York, and this is what happened. I mean, it's an acolyte profession. I became an assistant at HarperCollins, and there was so much paper, obviously, with the World Wide Web not being in existence truly. I spent inordinate amounts of time at the copier. I remember the first time I realized my inbox would never be empty, never, ever, ever, and that was horrifying to a type A personality. And it was supposed to be trade and business, but it really was more business. We did Built to Last by Jim Collins, which was incredible. And then my boss handed me this manuscript by Whitley Strieber. Does anyone remember Whitley Strieber? So he wrote this book called Communion about his interaction with aliens, no kidding. And it was a #1 bestseller, nonfiction. And so I did the follow-up. I edited it at all of age 24. He just handed it to me. And I wouldn't even know where to put that book in the library. Is it fiction or nonfiction? But anyway, that was my introduction. 9 months later, I went to Scribner. I had a boss there who was the most organized human being on the planet. She used to type her Post-it notes to me, "Please copy," 4 times. It was amazing because it freed me up to be creative and curious about other projects. So I started seeking my own projects. I also assisted on Mindhunter, which was amazing. I don't know if any of you have watched the show or read the book. He's a criminal profiler with the FBI. We published Barbara Bush's memoir, and we published the Pulitzer winner, Angela's Ashes, while I was there, which was amazing. This was also the time, because I was being so curious, I was thinking, I was ambitious, I was still working hours and hours at the copier, I was thinking about leaving the industry. I went down to visit my brother Josh, who had turned 21. We surprised him in Washington, D.C., and a friend of mine met us for drinks, and he'd been my next-door neighbor in Oregon, and he brought his girlfriend. His girlfriend said, "My mom's written a book, can I send it to you?" And I thought, oh yeah, sure, you know. Remember that slush story? Well, it turns out that she was a forensic anthropologist for the state of North Carolina and for Montreal. And I took 150 pages home on a Friday night, and I read them, and I thought they were incredible. And I had to go back to the office on Saturday morning and get the rest of the manuscript. And then I went out and I bought 3 Patricia Cornwell novels because I'd never read her before, and I knew that Kay Scarpetta was her character, and she was a forensic anthropologist. And I realized it really held up. So I read all those books over the week, and I walked in on Monday morning and I said, "I really think we should buy this book." And I was an assistant at the time. And they said, okay. And that book became a #1 bestseller. It was Deja Dead by Kathy Reichs. The television show Bones is based on it. So that was my big break. Got really, really lucky. And my boss, I was then noticed by another publisher who worked across town at Random House, and he was a genius, and his name was David Rosenthal, and he was just about to publish Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, and he just had great ideas, and he was very subversive. He was really open to my one and only acquisition, which was the Vagina Monologues. And at the time, I will tell you, I know that this is now part of like it's a pillar of women's studies, but at the time, it was 1997, no one said these words. And he loved the fact that this was the one book that I was going to bring in. And I was only there for 9 months, but I'd gone and I saw Eve Ensler perform, and I thought, she's a genius. And another publishing house had this under contract, but they wanted her to retitle it the V Monologues. Of course, this is beside the point. So I edited that book, and I got to edit Gloria Steinem, which was awesome. And then I went back to Simon. I went to Simon & Schuster. And to talk about range, I went from Eve Ensler to Hunter S. Thompson. For those of you who don't know who Hunter is, he's a gonzo journalist. He wrote Hell's Angels and Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. He's just an incredibly dangerous person. And I walked into my boss's office one afternoon, and there he was sitting in the chair with him, and I just read something that he had written in Time magazine, which I didn't realize how rare that was at the time. And I said, "Oh, Dr. Thompson, I'm so happy to meet you. I thought that was brilliant what you wrote." And then he said, "Oh, Marysue, what did you like about it?" And there I am, all of 27 years old, thinking, oh my God, I had an out-of-body experience. I don't know what I said, but he started clapping afterwards. And then he faxed my boss the next day and said, if we move the contract to Simon & Schuster, I want her to edit me. So I stepped into that role, and the first book I worked on with him was the Rum Diary, which was the first book he ever wrote in 1958 when he was 21 years old, before he published any of his nonfiction or journalism. He wrote a novel and a love story. It's a love triangle set in Puerto Rico. It is a terrible movie, but starring Johnny Depp. But it is a book that was really romantic, and he loved Fitzgerald, and it has that cadence. But he hadn't read it in 15 years. So I had to fly out to Colorado to work with him and reread it aloud to him, and he would say, cut, 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 or chop, chop, chop. And but there were 3 rules before I flew out there. My boss gave me 3 rules. They were no getting in the car with Hunter, no getting in the hot tub with Hunter, and no shooting guns with Hunter. I broke 2 of them. You can ask me later what they were. Oh no, I'm not doing that again. How did I do that? Oh my gosh. How did I do that? I'm so sorry. It was Hunter. It was the ghost of Hunter. What? Can we close it and get rid of it? Awesome. Okay. No, I'm sorry. Okay. All right. There's Hunter. So Hunter was wonderful. I worked with him for 10 years, and he was really fun to work with, actually, when he wasn't threatening us with guns. One of my favorite authors that I worked with when I was at Simon & Schuster, that first iteration, was Lisa Lutz. And if you haven't read her series, the Spellman series, it's a comedic crime series set in San Francisco. It's a dysfunctional family of private investigators, and it is hilarious. It has been optioned and lapsed maybe 16 times over the last 12 years, but I really think it's going to happen this time. So remember, you saw it here. I worked with her for 13 years, and her most recent book, The Passenger, she moved to psychological suspense, but one of my most fun. experiences. I also work with Sandra Brown. I wanted to show you this picture because I know publishing seems so musty. Sandra Brown was a model, and then she was a romance writer who moved into suspense, and she always looks like this. She still looks like this. It's amazing, and she is the loveliest woman, so I loved working with her. And then I had another big break, which was Chris Cleave. And Chris Cleave wrote a book called Incendiary. It was his first book, and he's a novelist. He's British, and it pivoted on a terrorist attack at Wembley Stadium, and it happened to be published on July 5th, 2005, which was the day of the London Underground bombings. And his U.S. publisher basically dropped him. It just, everything disappeared, and his campaign disappeared. And his agent came to me 3 years later with Little B, and she said, I've got a book for you. You have to read it. And we can see the way a book sells on this thing called BookScan. So I could see on my computer screen that it had sold about 3,000 copies, his first book. And the retailers are going to say, well, his second book is only going to sell 3,000 copies, so we'll take 50. So I said, Jen, don't do this to me. Don't do it. I'm looking at the screen. She said, just read it. Just read it. And I opened the book, and the first sentence, some days I wish I was a British pound coin instead of a Nigerian girl, just ripped my heart out. And it was one of the most beautiful books that I have ever worked on, and it sold over 1 million copies now. I bought it for a very small amount of money, and Chris is just a lovely man, and if you have a chance to read it, you should. I moved to Putnam. I had worked at Simon for 13 years. I wanted new challenges. I don't usually do celebrity books, but when the opportunity to work with Betty White came up, I mean, who could say no, right? She is as charming and funny as you can imagine. I went out to Los Angeles. I sat in the Beverly Wilshire with her, and I recorded her. I recorded her with this pen. It was the most amazing thing. So you could basically touch it to a piece of text that you were writing, and it would record the exact sentence that she was speaking at the time. And then I could take the pen and touch it to that word, and it would repeat what she had said at that moment. So it was this incredible device that I had never heard of until that moment. She named it Bruce. And she would show up in her car by herself with this string bag filled with pictures and toddle out. I was like, Betty White, what are you doing driving yourself into the Beverly Wilshire? So anyway, when that book came, when we finished it, she dedicated the book to her agent Loretta, to me, and to Bruce, which I love. So that was basically the only book that I bought at Putnam. I moved back to Mary Higgins Clark as editor-in-chief in 2012. My boss, who had taken me from Villard to Simon & Schuster, the genius, had been let go. A new boss had stepped in. He had called me a couple months after he got there and said, the only fiction worth doing is stuff that you bought. Would you come back? And I said, well, I have a contract. I can't. And by the way, you fired everyone. I know. And I was really scared. He knows this, so I can say it. And a year later to the day, he called me and said, will you think about it again? Will you be editor-in-chief? And I said, you know, when? Now? Is now good? So I came back and I got to work with Mary Higgins Clark, this queen of suspense, who has published every single book with Simon & Schuster in her career since Where Are the Children, and is just wonderful. And I set her up with Alifair Burke to write a series as well. Alifair Burke is a best-selling suspense writer on her own, and she's James Lee Burke's daughter, and she's a lawyer, and she's wonderful. And so that's been a really happy couple. So I guess we've worked on about 10 books together. I got to work with Lauren Weisberger again when I came back, and I had worked on every book with her since The Devil Wears Prada, and I got to publish with her Revenge Wears Prada and When Life Gives You Lululemons, which are both sequels to Prada, and that was just fun because we would sit down together and work out the plots and really build the stories from the base up. One of my favorite books that I worked on was with Shonda Rhimes. Shonda Rhimes, if you don't know, is the creator of Grey's Anatomy, How to Get Away with Murder, and Scandal. She's one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. And she came into Simon & Schuster. She's also a single mother of 3. And she came into Simon & Schuster, and she was really quiet. And I thought, well, that meeting didn't go very well. She met with me and my boss. And the agent called and said, she loved you. And I thought, wow, okay. And then that book, which was about parenting, became the year of yes, because what I didn't realize is that she's a serious introvert with a crippling sense of shyness. And so about 2 years after we signed the book, we thought we're never going to see this parenting book. She took on this challenge from her sister. Her sister said, you never say yes to anything. Say yes. Just say yes. And she said, okay, for 1 year, I'm going to say yes to everything. And it completely changed her life. And this is her memoir, and she wrote it in about 5 months. She talks about television writing as laying down track for an oncoming train. And that's how this book was written. I mean, I can still remember July 4th weekend being with my parents in Rhode Island, and I'm getting the call that she's changed it again, and she's written a new chapter, and it was supposed to only be X number of chapters and done 3 weeks earlier. And anyway, it all worked out. It's a really good book. My former assistant said this book changed her life. So Nelson DeMille, as I mentioned, was somebody I wrote to for years, and he had spent 30 years published at a different publisher, and we finally prevailed and got him to come to Simon & Schuster. That's us at BEA last week. I worked on him with his #1 bestseller, The Cuban Affair, and his new book, The Deserter, he wrote with his son, Alex, who's an award-winning screenwriter. And it's loosely based on the Bo Bergdahl story. I don't know if you know. Bo Bergdahl was the deserter in Afghanistan. It was very controversial. He was traded for some Taliban prisoners. But it's set in Venezuela. So the whole thing is kind of ripped from the headlines. It's really good. It's coming out in November. This is just a special one to me. This book was 10 years in the making. Matt Thomas was teaching English at Xavier Academy, the high school in New York City, and he was living in a 1-bedroom with his twins in the bedroom and he and his wife on the fold-out couch. And he had this book that is just this gorgeous book about this woman, Eileen. It covers the decades, it's kind of the unwinding of the middle class of America in the 20th century. It follows her from her humble beginnings in Queens until her desperate aspirations to live in Bronxville. And the minute she gets the house in Bronxville, they have this terrible diagnosis with her husband. And it goes from there, and it's just really beautiful. And what I love about this book is that I think we all, as editors, aspire to do books that last. I have the books that are entertaining and that start conversations, and then I have books that I think will stand the test of time, and this is one of them. And in fact, Stephen King discovered this book 4 years after it was published, just last summer, and he tweeted that it was the best book he had read last year. I work with Alice Hoffman now, she is the antithesis of Matt. She writes so fast that we can barely publish her. Her mind is working all the time. She's an incredible storyteller, and her magnum opus, I think, is coming out this fall. It is set in World War II, for those of you who love World War II fiction. I'm told by booksellers that people come in and ask for World War II fiction, which just really stuns me, but I think people like the kind of fine line of good versus evil. But I worked on The Marriage of Opposites, which is about the Pedro Pizarro's mother, and Faithful, which was a contemporary coming-of-age story, and Rules of Magic, which is the prequel to Practical Magic, the celebrated movie. I work with Rebecca Traister. She's somebody I followed for 5 years before she signed with me, and I signed all the single ladies at a different publisher, and they let me take it with me, and it became one of our best reviewed books of the year that we published it in 2016, also a bestseller. And this one is just about the favorite book that I've ever worked on, so I had to put it up here for you. It's a memoir by Nina Riggs. Nina Riggs, when she was 36 years old, was diagnosed with cancer, one small spot, and she wrote, and then 18 months later, it was terminal. And she wrote this modern love piece in the New York Times about how she was desperately trying to buy a couch, but a couch was more than a couch because she was leaving it for her husband and her 2 sons, who happened to be 4 and 7 at the time. And that piece became this book. She was a published poet, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And it is a meditation on how to live life fully. It is absolutely buoyant. It is not sad. She wrote this book in 5 months, and she got to hold the finished book. She did pass away before we published it, but this is just such a special book. She revisits Montaigne, who also suffered a great deal of grief, but lived in an incredibly meaningful way. So That's one that I just love, and I have to put it up there. A lot of people wonder how the book actually gets made, and so I want to tell you a little bit about why your books cost the money that they do. I don't know how many of you come to the library. I love the library. The library is amazing. I hope you'll also buy books sometimes. We have, when I work on a book, this is actually a manuscript that I edited. Those are my notes. I work from macro to micro. I annotate, and most editors do that. This is how it goes. I think the majority of my books take about 3 drafts back and forth. I send it, the author responds, I send more notes, the author responds. And to give you an idea, I've been doing this for 25 years. I still can't get any faster. It takes me an hour to edit 20 pages. That's just bottom line. So every book takes me 12 to 15 hours to edit, and it's painstaking. So that's another reason you really have to love the book before you sign it up. And then after I have the final draft, we've counted at one point 30 different people touch that book in the publishing house before it goes to here, the bookstore, into the New Canaan Library. So, you have the copy editor, the designer, the art director, the managing editor, the production manager, the marketer, the publicist, the salespeople, dozens of them. They go out to the retailers. The inventory manager, the printer, the warehouse. It's just endless. And these are people who are really, really good at their jobs. I could never be a copy editor. Never, never. I mean, grammar is not mine. But anyway, so I want to, a lot of people have talked about the demise of publishing and how the digital revolution was going to end book publishing. And in fact, book sales have been up. Hardcover book sales have been up since 2013 every single year, incrementally, which is pretty amazing. Audiobooks have been extraordinary. They're up 22% on 2018 over 2017. And what I love about that is that 54% of the people who are reading audiobooks regularly are under the age of 45. And they're mostly people who just want to consume more. They read across other formats as well, but they also want the audiobooks. They want to be able to read as many books as possible. It's like binge reading. So, this new era of the Netflix and Apple that has the production arm and all the different production companies and great television is really helpful to us. Most of my books have been optioned now. Most of my novels have been optioned, and whether or not they get made remains to be seen. But people are looking for great storytellers and great content. So that's hopeful to me. Here are some of the books that we're going to publish very soon. This is a book that's practical advice for living life and facing death. It's a beginner's guide to the end by a hospice worker. It's everything from spiritual acceptance and preparation to figuring out where to put your passwords. Really, really wonderful. This, Copeland, is incredible. It reads like a thriller. It's from the same editor who brought you Red Notice, if you guys read that book, by Bill Browder. It's incredible. I think he appeared here, didn't he? So this is the inside story of Koch Industries, which is a private company, and it's one of the wealthiest companies in our nation. And it has really nefarious business practices. Sidney Blumenthal, this is his second volume of his Lincoln trilogy. Janis Joplin's authoritative biography. It's never been done before. Can you believe that? We have How We Fight for Our Lives, which is a debut memoir by Saeed Jones, who is an award-winning poet. It's his coming-of-age memoir. It's incredible. Mobituaries. Mo Rocca is the CBS Sunday morning correspondent, and he has a podcast that I would highly recommend called Mobituaries, where he excavates lives that you've forgotten about and gives them obituaries that they deserve. Like Audrey Hepburn's was incredible. So this is Martin Cruz Smith. He wrote Gorky Park. His character Arkady Renko is back. And Christopher Buckley, who brought you Thank You for Smoking, makes Russia great again. He's a great satirist. Here are my novels that are coming out between now and the end of the year. So I give a special plug for Megan Miranda, who is a wonderful thriller writer. She wrote All the Missing Girls. This is her 3rd book with us, and we've sold about 1.5 million copies of her books, so she's somebody to watch. This is about a friendship gone awry between a summer girl and someone who comes in summers in a resort town and a girl who's a local. The Need, Helen Phillips, is incredible. She's coming out, this is coming out in July, and it's a speculative thriller. The Dearly Beloved is one of my favorite novels that I've published in recent time. It is like crossing to safety, two couples across 3 decades. They meet in 1963 in New York City when the husbands are named co-pastors of the Third Presbyterian Church. And it grapples with faith in all its forms, faith in God, in religion, in self, in marriage, in friendship, and in humanity. It's really beautiful. The Deserter I mentioned, Alice Hoffman I mentioned, The World That We Knew. I do think this is going to be her best-selling book ever. It's set in 1941 Berlin, when a mother makes a choice to send her daughter away on the trains, and she goes to a rabbi for help. And I don't know if you've read Alice Hoffman, but she does magical realism. So she goes to a rabbi for help, and the rabbi says no, but his daughter is listening at the door, his 14-year-old daughter, and his 14-year-old daughter has always been eavesdropping, and she knows what to do. She creates a mystical creature to protect them. And it's a golem, it's a female golem. And if you had told me that I would love a book about a golem, I would tell you, pigs are flying, because no. But Alice Hoffman makes you believe in anything. She's incredible. And Mary Higgins Clark, solo book, Kiss the Girls, which is, she's 91, turning 92, and it's her Me Too novel. Go get them, right? So what keeps it interesting, if you haven't gotten a clue from my passion here on the stage, every book is like its own new class. It has its own complexities. It has its challenges. I feel like I'm constantly learning. I think that people who write books are incredibly brave and amazing. And I've told my assistants, if that ever fails, if when I get a book off the printer, I freak out every time. Like, this is so beautiful, and I run around, and I said, if this stops happening, tell me to hang it up. There's no template. Every single book is different, and everything is changing so rapidly. You used to be able to look at the New York Times or the Chicago Review of Books or something. Those places are disappearing, so every place the way you discover books is fascinating to me. Let me know how you find your books, because we're always learning. We're always trying to figure out, how do we get you? How do we get your audience? How do we reach you? Reading is my happy place. It has always been my happy place. I used to wake up before school and read books, and I can't believe I get to do this for a living. Recently, my daughter said to me, now this may have been a ruse, because she does like to stay up later, but I said, I'm going to turn out the light, because I'll go into my room and she'll still be reading. And I said, I'm gonna come in and turn out the light. And I turned out the light, and she came into my room and she said, but Mommy, reading's my happy place. And I thought, low blow. So why read? For those of you, I imagine all of you in this room read books, but in case you don't, there are so many reasons to read. Especially for fiction, I'm just going to give a big self-interested plug here, because fiction has been linked to greater empathy, especially literary fiction. Detective fiction makes you solve problems better. Literature helps us think about how to live, how to love, how to make sense of the world. It makes us think about why we exist and how we exist, and it gives us courage in the face of challenges and death. And we are doing a book next year with a neuroscientist and a PhD in literature that actually talks about how the brain changes when we read, how healthy it is, and how it can combat anxiety and depression. And this is reading books, getting an escape. There's no better way, in my humble opinion, no better way to escape than diving into a book. And I'm happy to take your questions now. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, good. Thanks. Oh, sure. Okay. Thank you.
Mary, so it always surprised me. What would you do if you were the editor and John Irving walked in and said, here's my manuscript? How do you get away with telling him, nah, that we're going to change this?
Well, it's funny you bring up John Irving because he's notoriously allergic to edits. But you know, I always say that it's your book and your name is on the book, and my job is to try to interpret your best intentions and optimize what's on the page so that the reader understands what you're trying to do. But ultimately, you know, some of my edits are rejected, and I do have a conversation. I always say, this is a conversation, read the annotations. There is always a moment where they panic and grieve and gnash their teeth, and then they come around and say, okay, I'm ready to talk about this, and maybe you're right on some of them. So that's how it goes.
Thank you so much for being here. I have a question over
Hi,
here.
sure.
Hi. Thank you. Marysue, when you get the books published, has there ever been a real surprise when the author has thanked you within the book? Can you give us an example of something? Because most of the time they thank you in some section of the book, I would assume. Yeah?
Yeah, in the acknowledgments. I mean, I was surprised when Hunter dedicated the Rum Diary to me as well, and that was a total shock. I make it a practice not to read the acknowledgments because I don't when they're going into production, because if they don't thank me profusely, you know, I might lose some energy. But I also don't think it's my place to edit them. Sometimes people go over the top and I get uncomfortable, and then I think, how am I supposed to edit this? You know, I'm editing your thank you. So I guess that's, if that answers your question. Sure.
Were you to write a book of your own starting tomorrow,
Oh dear.
where would you go? Biography, historical fiction, mysteries? Any ideas?
To write one?
You. Right.
Me. I would research first, because I don't find my own experiences nearly as interesting as those of people who I've admired in history, or kind of those hidden historical figures. I love those books that teach you about a world that you don't know through a character you've never met before because they've been kind of disappeared. So that's what I'd do. I'd go into history stacks, and then I'd find some tiny little footnote and follow it down a rabbit hole.
I think we'll all read it.
Oh, thank you.
I want to say thank you for all your information. It's really interesting. And I've helped 4 or 5 authors sell books for names you wouldn't recognize, but I was able to help them sell over 20,000 books.
Good for you.
I feel really good about that, especially after some of the numbers that you were talking about up there. But what I was curious about is you have these superstar names that I'm curious about the tiers of authors that you have and what expectations you have of them helping you sell the book. Like, what do you expect them? Book signings seem to be going out of place, but people are on TV, on the radio, podcasts. You know, about how much time would you expect an author to spend on any of those avenues, or any insights like that? I appreciate.
Sure. And that's a good question. I should mention that I gave you some of my big kahunas in there. I also do books that you have never heard of. I do books that are really heart projects for me, that sell very few copies, but that are that I think are really, really talented writers who will have careers that I'm going to be proud to work on. So what we always say, and what I expect from an author, is that they'll do their best to sell the book. And that means something different for every author. Some authors don't want to be on social media at all. I'd never force them to be. I can point them in the direction of taking one path rather than 6. You know, it doesn't make any sense if you're peripatetic and you're on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and you don't choose one. But I always ask them to find something that makes them feel comfortable. More and more we ask authors to, even if they've written fiction, to think about something that relates to the book, that is interesting to other people, that they might write about in a nonfiction way. And sometimes that that doesn't move the needle at all. I have an author, Jessica Knoll, who wrote a book called Luckiest Girl Alive. It was a Reese pick. It was a huge bestseller. And she wrote a piece that appears in this weekend's Times about intuitive eating. Now, we wanted to publish that when the paperback came out, but it's now 6 weeks after the paperback or 2 months after the paperback. That's not going to sell one book. But we had the intention of her doing that so that it could dovetail into the book. So sometimes these things work out and sometimes they don't. And every book has its own life. But what I do take issue with is when an author says, well, I won't appear here, and I don't want to do that, or I appear reluctantly. I'd rather you not appear at all.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to ask, what advice would you give to somebody who's a brand new writer of poetry? Is poetry dead? Is it very difficult to sell it? And secondly, what advice would you give to a writer who's never been published? To publish on Amazon first and garner sales and move forward that way? I wonder what your advice would be. Thank you.
I mean, I think that for an unpublished author, getting feedback is huge. And I think I always recommend that if you find a writer group, to edify you and to figure out other avenues. I hesitate to suggest that anyone go to Amazon first. I think that certainly with poetry, there are really niche poetry publishers. And we don't do it well. We have tried. But there are certainly, I mean, Nina Riggs, who I mentioned, she published her poetry at a small publisher before I published her memoir, and it had absolutely no adverse effect. It sold probably 800 copies, but it had no deleterious effect on our sales for the memoir. So, I think I wish I had better advice or more concrete advice, but every single project has different challenges. I think poetry is challenging for sure. You're not going to get rich writing it unless you're Rupi Kaur, and she's an Instagram poet. So or rather a YouTube poet. YouTube and Instagram, right? Has anyone read her? No. Okay, The Sun and Other Flowers. She's sold millions of copies. I mean, in that way, poetry has become mainstream. But I would look at her and see, if there's any similarity.
Thank you. So, Rich.
Just one question. Since you guys play such a big role in developing the IP and the branding and the positioning, do you all participate if it goes on to be turned into a TV series or a movie or any other sort of? That seems not fair.
Yes. No, I know. The agent gets a percentage, typically. If we do have an IP initiative at the imprint, and we've come up with a number of books that we own outright, the ideas, and we've developed the novel or the other nonfiction idea. If we sell those rights, we get some of them. In fact, we did have an option with CBS, which is a little, that's inside baseball. But no, I know. See, a finance person, right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
We often here get to hear authors talk about their process.
Yeah.
Hearing what else happens has just been tremendous.
Oh, cool. I'm so glad. Thank you. Thank you so much.